We are accustomed to seeing Israel on the front lines, a nation forged in conflict, perpetually facing external threats. Today that image holds true, but with a critical, and perhaps unprecedented addition. Israel is again fighting a war on multiple fronts, a stark reality etched in headlines and echoed in the daily anxieties of its citizens. But alongside the very real battles waged beyond its borders, another, perhaps equally consequential, struggle is erupting within Israel itself. Look beyond the familiar narratives of regional instability and geopolitical maneuvering, and you will see a nation grappling with a profound internal crisis. Tens of thousands are in the streets, voices rising in protest. Former pillars of the establishment, figures who have long embodied the very principles of Israeli justice, are sounding alarms, warning of a descent into civil war. And at the heart of this escalating turmoil lies a series of actions emanating from the highest office, actions that are not merely policy shifts but rather appear to be calculated strikes at the very foundations of the Israeli state. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has initiated the dismissal of the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, and is now moving to remove the Attorney General, moves justified by a crisis of confidence and accusations of obstruction. These are not isolated incidents, but rather the opening salvos in what is rapidly becoming a legal showdown, a confrontation that threatens to unravel the delicate fabric of Israeli society at the very moment it faces existential external threats. To truly grasp the gravity of this unfolding drama, we must understand the context in which these dismissals are occurring. To truly grasp the gravity of this unfolding drama, we must understand the context in which these dismissals are occurring. This isn't simply about personnel changes, it's about power and the fault lines within Israeli society that have been exposed and indeed deepened in recent years. Consider the events of early 2023, the attempted judicial overhaul. That initiative, launched by the current government, was not an isolated policy proposal, but rather a catalyst that ignited mass protests, revealing a profound societal schism regarding the very essence of Israeli governance. The core issue then, as it remains now, was the balance of power, specifically the relationship between the elected government and the judiciary, the very institutions designed to provide checks and balances. Critics, then and now, warned that weakening the judiciary would concentrate excessive power in the hands of the executive, potentially eroding fundamental democratic safeguards. The government's counter-argument that the courts were overly interventionist, obstructing the popular will, only amplified the existing tensions. Then came October 7th. The Hamas attacks and the subsequent war momentarily eclipsed the internal divisions, or so it seemed. But the underlying fault lines remained, and the catastrophic security failure acted not as a unifier, but as a new point of fracture. In the aftermath, the question of accountability became paramount, and in the ensuing scramble for political survival, we observe a familiar pattern: the deflection of blame. Instead of accepting responsibility for systemic failures, the Prime Minister has consistently sought to shift culpability onto the security and intelligence apparatus, invoking the specter of a deep state, allegedly working against him. The dismissals of Ronen Bar and the move against the Attorney General must be seen through this lens. They are not merely responses to October 7th, they are extensions of a pre-existing power struggle, intensified by the trauma of that day and the urgent need to manage political fallout. The dismissal of Bar, in particular, triggered immediate and significant backlash. Why? Because it was perceived, not just by protesters but by many within the establishment, as an assault on the very principle of institutional independence. The timing, coinciding with a Shin Bet investigation into potential foreign influence within the Prime Minister's office, and Netanyahu's own ongoing corruption trial, further fueled suspicions. To many, it appeared as a calculated move to either punish Bar for pursuing inconvenient investigations, or to preemptively derail them. This action, in turn, served to galvanize opposition, drawing tens of thousands into the streets and prompting stark warnings from legal authorities. The Supreme Court's immediate intervention, issuing an injunction against Bar's dismissal, demonstrates the institutional pushback already underway, setting the stage for a direct confrontation between the executive and judicial branches. And this confrontation, make no mistake, carries within it the seeds of a far wider and more destabilizing crisis. However, it's crucial to acknowledge that the narrative is not monolithic. While many observers, and indeed a significant portion of the Israeli populace, view these dismissals as an assault on democratic norms and institutional integrity, there is another perspective, one that, while perhaps less publicly voiced by independent analysts, nonetheless exists and informs the actions of the current government. From this contrasting viewpoint, the narrative is not one of power consolidation, but of decisive leadership. It frames the dismissals not as attacks on institutions, but as necessary corrective measures to address systemic failures exposed by the October 7th catastrophe. The argument, implicitly or explicitly, is that in times of existential threat, strong, centralized executive action is paramount, and that perceived obstacles, be they from within the security apparatus or the legal establishment, must be removed for the sake of national survival. This perspective may even portray the judicial pushback as itself being obstructive, a rigid adherence to outdated norms in a moment demanding radical change and decisive action. In this light, the government's actions are not seen as undermining democracy, but as redefining it, perhaps even strengthening it, at least in the eyes of its proponents, by prioritizing executive efficacy and national security above what they might perceive as procedural or institutional constraints. This alternative framing, however, does not negate the very real dangers inherent in the current trajectory. In fact, it may amplify them, for if the government genuinely believes in the necessity of its actions and views any opposition, legal or popular, as illegitimate obstruction, then the potential for a direct clash, a head-on collision between the branches of government and between the government and its own citizenry, becomes not just possible but increasingly probable. And it is this very prospect of a direct, unresolved confrontation that truly raises the specter of internal upheaval, of the Civil War warnings we are now hearing with increasing frequency and alarm, and it is this very prospect of a direct, unresolved confrontation that truly raises the specter of internal upheaval, of the Civil War warnings we are now hearing with increasing frequency and alarm. But to simply label this as a constitutional crisis, or a power struggle, risks oversimplifying a far more complex and deeply rooted phenomenon. We must delve deeper, beyond the immediate political maneuvers and legal challenges, to understand the underlying currents driving this internal turmoil. Consider the very nature of the Israeli state, a nation forged in the crucible of constant threat, lacking a codified constitution, and reliant on a delicate, often unwritten, balance of power between its branches of government. In such a system, the Supreme Court has traditionally functioned as a crucial, perhaps the crucial, check on executive power, a role it assumed not by explicit constitutional mandate, but through evolving precedent and societal acceptance. This system, however, has always been inherently fragile, dependent on a degree of consensus and mutual restraint that appears to be eroding rapidly. The current crisis is not merely about the legality of specific dismissals, but about the very legitimacy of this established order and the unspoken rules that have governed Israeli governance for decades. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not just a legal showdown, but a fundamental challenge to the established power structure, a contest over the very definition of Israeli democracy and the principles upon which it should operate. And at the heart of this challenge lies a critical question. In the face of profound existential threats and deep societal divisions, can this unwritten constitutional order, this delicate balance of powers, withstand the strain? Or are we witnessing the prelude to a more profound and potentially destabilizing transformation of the Israeli state itself? The answer, it seems, is far from certain, and the coming weeks will be critical in determining the trajectory of this unfolding internal battle, a battle that may ultimately prove as consequential for Israel's future as any external conflict it currently faces. And are we witnessing the prelude to a more profound and potentially destabilizing transformation of the Israeli state itself? The answer, it seems, is far from certain, and the coming weeks will be critical in determining the trajectory of this unfolding internal battle, a battle that may ultimately prove as consequential for Israel's future as any external conflict it currently faces. Indeed, the ramifications of this internal strife extend far beyond the immediate legal and political arena. They resonate across the entire strategic landscape of Israel, both domestically and internationally. Consider, first and foremost, the impact on national unity, a critical asset for any nation, but especially for one facing persistent existential threats. Internal conflict, particularly one that pits core state institutions against each other and fuels widespread civil unrest, directly undermines this unity. At a moment when Israel is engaged in active military operations on multiple fronts, this internal division represents a significant strategic vulnerability. It degrades societal resilience, diverting attention and resources from external threats, and potentially weakening the national will necessary for sustained campaigns. Furthermore, the very act of challenging the authority of the Supreme Court, of even contemplating disregarding its rulings, carries profound implications for the rule of law within Israel. The erosion of this principle, the foundation of any stable democratic state, has long-term consequences that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. It weakens the legitimacy of state institutions, potentially fueling further social fragmentation and creating a climate of instability that can be exploited by both internal and external actors. Internationally, the spectacle of a nation seemingly at war with itself, grappling with fundamental questions about its own democratic character, cannot but damage Israel's standing and influence. In a world where perceptions of legitimacy and adherence to international norms are increasingly important, such internal turmoil erodes soft power and strains alliances. Key partners may become hesitant, questioning the stability and reliability of a state seemingly consumed by internal divisions. And perhaps most critically, this internal preoccupation, this deepening crisis of governance, creates exploitable vulnerabilities in a highly volatile region. External adversaries are adept at recognizing and capitalizing on internal weaknesses. A state distracted by internal strife, its institutions in conflict, and its population divided, becomes a more tempting target, a less formidable opponent. The looming legal showdown in Israel, therefore, is not merely a domestic political drama. It is a strategic inflection point, a moment of profound consequence that will shape not only the internal character of the Israeli state, but also its position and security in an increasingly precarious geopolitical environment. The stakes in this internal battle are arguably as high, if not higher, than in any of the external conflicts Israel currently confronts. The stakes in this internal battle are arguably as high, if not higher, than in any of the external conflicts Israel currently confronts. And so, we arrive at a critical juncture. This is not merely a legal argument unfolding in courtrooms, nor simply a political contest played out in the streets. What we are witnessing in Israel today is something far more fundamental, a nation grappling with its own identity, its own definition of governance, at a moment of extreme peril. The external wars are undeniable. The threat's palpable, but it is this internal struggle, this legal showdown, that may ultimately determine Israel's true resilience, its enduring strength, and its capacity to navigate the turbulent waters ahead. For it is within this crucible of internal conflict that the future of Israel, not just its immediate political landscape, but its very character as a state, is now being forged, tested, and ultimately defined. The world watches not merely as a spectator to a domestic drama, but as a witness to a process that will inevitably reshape the strategic calculus of an entire region, and potentially beyond.
Thanks so much for watching!
If you enjoyed this analysis, and be sure to give it a thumbs up, and hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical insights like this. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going! Share this video with anyone interested in deeper perspectives on current events. Until next time, stay informed and think critically. Thank you.